Hello everyone. Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Uh, on behalf of the World Federation of Pediatric Intensive and Critical Care Societies and the Pediatric Respiratory Critical Care subchapter of it, we would like to welcome you all for our monthly webinar. And today we have our fabulous expert speakers with us to speak upon a new topic. I would like to take this moment first to thank all of you who are joining in and to introduce the team who is behind this amazing series of pediatric respiratory critical care series. And I would like to introduce the team and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Michael. So I'm Milind. I'm a pediatric intensivist from India, and I'm also the co-chair for the medical subdivision of WFPICCS Education Committee, and we have been conducting this pediatric respiratory critical care series webinars since past 4 months now, and we have been getting very fabulous feedbacks and response from all of you. Thanks for joining in. And Dr. Martin, who's here with us again, has been our inaugural speaker and expert faculty, and we are glad to have him again. So in our team from WFPICCS Pediatric Respiratory Critical Care subchapter, we are 5 of us. Myself, as I said, we have Georgie Pizimolas. He is a senior physiotherapist and also the chair for AHP for the Education Committee of WFPICCS, and she works at Queensland Children's Hospital, Brisbane, Australia, with an extensive experience in pediatric critical care, acute respiratory physiotherapy and multidisciplinary education. She has been very instrumental in organizing and conducting these webinars. Along with us we have Dr. Abdul Rahman. He is a pediatric intensivist and a critical care consultant at Ahmadi Hospital in PICU from Kuwait. He has a lot of research and publications in his name, and he is doing a great job at Kuwait. We have Dr. Farhan Rashid Sheikh. He is the senior pediatric intensivist and a well-known faculty in pediatric intensive care in India. He has been a mentor to many pediatric intensivists in India, and he heads the PICU at Rainbow Children's Hospital, Hyderabad in India. We have Dr. Michael Canary, who's an associate professor of pediatrics at Yale School of Medicine and an attending physician in pediatric intensive care at Yale New Haven Children's Hospital. So I would like to welcome you all once again and hand over to Dr. Michael to introduce our experts for today.
Thank you, Milind. It's my pleasure to introduce our guests. So Dr. Natalie Napolitano is a research therapist and clinical scientist in the respiratory therapy department at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. At CHOP, she runs a bench lab and guides evidence-based practice and clinical research important to the science of pediatric respiratory care. She is active within the state of Pennsylvania and in the National Respiratory Therapy Association. She also serves on the Pediatric Steering Committee for the Hôpital Sacré-Cœur in Milo, Haiti. We're also fortunate to have Dr. Martin Kneyber back with us today. Dr. Kneyber really needs no introduction. His name appears on many of the most important and insightful research papers on pediatric respiratory support and mechanical ventilation. He's chief of the Division of Pediatric Critical Care Medicine at the Pediatric Hospital and Children's Hospital, rather, at the University Medical Center in Groningen in the Netherlands, among many other titles, and of course, a world-renowned researcher and educator. So thank you both for joining us today. Natalie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone on the committee, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you all are seeing my slides.
Natalie, okay. Your audio is a bit unclear.
All right, let me get closer to my computer and see if that helps. Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah, no, it's
I've never been, now I'm a little too close. I've never been accused of being soft-spoken, so I'll have to I'll have
Yeah.
to do better at that. Oh my. All
Those
right.
those working in pediatric intensive care are always blamed. They're never soft spoken.
Well, let's get started then. So the title of this presentation and our objectives were created by the panel to create a nice, evenly flowing education curriculum for everyone. So we're going to look under the hood on how modern day ventilators work and kind of go back from the beginning to where we started to be where we are. Oftentimes, the best way to understand where things are now is to understand the history. So that's what we're going to do. As a researcher, as I'm sure all of you know, I do have some disclosures. I don't shy away from working with industry. I feel as if working together with them is how we actually can get the devices that we need for our kids. They oftentimes make devices for adults, and they think about kids afterwards, as we all know. So we have to tell them what we want. So my institution does have research contracts or consulting contracts with the industry listed here, but all contracts and everything, all money exchange, all of the uncomfortable conversations, all go through our lawyers. I just do the fun clinical stuff. So these are going to be our objectives for the next 20 or 30 minutes here. It's a lofty, a lot of objectives to try to get through. So we won't be doing anything very high level, but I think that is kind of the point, as you'll have some talks later on that are going to go through some of this a lot more in depth. So taking a look at a timeline for mechanical ventilation overall, the onset of mechanical ventilation started in 1838 with this tank ventilator that you see here. To be honest, this is the first time I'd seen this after 25 years of practice as a respiratory therapist. This was first described by a Scottish physician, John Dalzell, in 1838, and it consists of a airtight box where the patient had to sit in a sitting position inside with their head out the top of the box, and it was negative pressure, and that was established by a manual pump that you can see there on the left, which kind of looks like a bicycle pump, where the air was pumped into and out of the box, and the device was equipped with a pressure gauge and monitor, as you can see on the side. I'm sure it was probably not as big as it is there in the picture, but there was a monitor gauge right there on the device, and that is how they established negative pressure. So it was very much a manual process. Next, put them all in there. In 1911, by Dreger, they established the first positive pressure device, which was mostly used for non-invasive, and that was introduced in 1911. Looks a little medieval of that device, but that was the first introduction of positive pressure, and it was quite sophisticated at the time. It was pneumatically operated, called the pulmotor, and it was really not for continuous use. It was predominantly used for intermittent treatments at the time. Next, 1930s through the 1960s, they really dove into negative pressure ventilation and really tried to optimize that. And that is how we got the iron lung, which was most widely used during the polio epidemic, with the development by Drinker and Shaw. And over the course of time, negative pressure did transition from the iron lung into a chest cuirass, or something that looked more like a raincoat style device. Personal story here, the reason I actually got into respiratory therapy and got interested in mechanical ventilation, when I was 16, I was a counselor at a camp for kids with muscular dystrophy. We were out in the woods with, we did have running water and electricity in the cabins, but it's a cabin full of teenage children, were from age probably 9 up, through 18. And in my very first cabin as a 16-year-old, I had a girl who slept in an iron lung machine, and so that their daughter could attend this week-long camp, which was a lot of fun. They brought her iron lung, and it was sitting on the floor in our cabin. So that was my first introduction at 16 as to what, mechanical ventilation. There were other girls on non-invasive devices and BiPAP and CPAP, but this was what she preferred to use, and they had people scouring all over the place to find parts to keep her iron lung going. And it wasn't until she was in her mid-30s that she had to switch over to positive pressure, and she was very hateful about that. She really liked the negative pressure much better, and she is still alive. But there was, up until recently, so at least one iron lung still going that I knew about. And then in 1960, they dove in farther to positive pressure to develop that out with the Bird Mark 7s and the Bennett TV2P. And this was really towards the end of World War II. And there was more of a need, or at least the ability to see how they could build that out with the way the masks and the fighter jets were being able to breathe up in the air. So moving on next, 1960s, 1970s was still further developing positive pressure ventilation, and it was used more commonly now for life support, both invasively and non-invasively. And this rhythmic inflation apparatus is what it was called, by Green and Janway were the developers of this. And then in the 1970s to 1980s, they moved on to volume-controlled ventilation only that was patient-triggered. And there were two things that really happened to make this change in this concept in non-invasive. The IPPB faded away at this time, and instead of spirometry came about, which we don't use anymore either, but either one of these devices, but it was thought to say that it was both of these, instead of spirometry and blowing into a bottle, were more accurate, more effective at preventing postoperative atelectasis than continuing to do intermittent IPPB treatments. And then we had the arrival of more modern day positive pressure machines in the 1980s to the present, which were predominantly pressure controlled devices at this time and mostly single limb and non-invasive. You can see some of those devices that we all still probably know. And in fact, in our top middle here, the V60s just now have gone out. So it was the last of the original machines that now is no longer being serviced or used. For modern day generation and how that kind of stepped through, early 1900s through the mid 1970s was our first generation, only volume controlled at first, interestingly enough. And then in 1970s through 1980s, we first started seeing some patient triggered inspiration. And with our first generations here, there was really no monitoring systems, no alarms, and there was no PEEP. And then with this second generation is when we really started to see PEEP being introduced, but it was really old school by placing the expiratory limb underwater and introduced some simple monitoring with alarms and patient-triggered breaths, but it was a separate external gas flow for IMV. And then third, in the 1980s and 1990s is really when we started to get some microprocessor control with all the modes as possible. And really, at this point, with enough money and time with industry, they're able to really develop anything out that they could think about. And in our fourth generation here in the late 1990s to present, we have a ton of modes. We have devices that are categorized more as ICU or subacute versus transport. And we have that introduction of closed loop modes. And then present day, we really offer modes, including our exactive support and advanced monitoring systems such as esophageal pressure. And we can now include waveforms and scalars, and we have more information than a lot of people probably know how to use, which is why we go through training and education continuously. But how these devices are driven and the guts of them are really important when you're trying to choose a device. Their gas delivery is either a compressed gas is the most common for ICU ventilators, and it's dependent on having medical grade oxygen and air sources at a high pressure. Generally 40 psi is what all of these devices are calibrated to want coming into them. So if they don't get 40 psi of gas of both gas sources, you will have alarms, and it won't be able to function as it should. With this, you get more accurate oxygen monitoring, but it does limit your mobility and your locations of use. Otherwise, you have turbine-driven machines. They only require an oxygen source if you want to have an FiO2 over 21%, but if there's no need for that, if you want to just run off of oxygen, off of room air, then you can do that and it will function. Pulls in ambient air to mix with the oxygen to give the desired FiO2. You often have tidal volume and inspiratory time limits, which is a problem for pediatrics. And it's not just that you have a limit of one necessarily, but it's the combination. So you have to have, to get a lower tidal volume, you need to have a much longer I time and vice versa. So you can't always get the tidal volume inspiratory time combination that you would necessarily want. Can also have some triggering and synchrony limitations because they're oftentimes not as sensitive because of the mechanics internally. And then it is often better for transporting patients or even for at-home use. In our step-down unit, we predominantly use home care ventilators that are turbine-driven. That way, you know, kids can be mobile. Kids need to be kids. So that is oftentimes what is best and easier. You can't provide high-pressure oxygens and medical air sources in the home. And depending on wherever your environment is, if you don't have good medical grade oxygen and air, you may prefer to have a turbine-driven machine. And some of them are very good, particularly for adults, but for children, you really have to take a look at how well their triggering is and their synchrony and kind of your limits on pressure and tidal volume, mostly for the lower limit when you're choosing one of these, and really need to take a look at their battery power. So the oxygen source, as well as air and your electricity sources and how often you're going to have good stable electricity, so that you can see how long the battery is. Some of these batteries are very long lasting and are hot swappable, which is really nice. When taking a look at their sensors, most of them now have flow and pressure sensors, so they can more accurately measure tidal volume, minute ventilation, as well as pressure and flow. That can really help us with some other diagnostic pieces when looking at the loops and scalars that we can now see that will come from these flow sensors. And then the location of the flow sensors is also an important piece, whether they're proximal or distal or within the circuit. If they're within the circuit, it can actually be fairly accurate for those that have used the LTV ventilator with their very big tubing. They didn't have small tubing because it didn't matter. Their flow sensors were right on the within the Y of the ventilator circuit, and they were fairly accurate, particularly with triggering, even with very small children. We still use the LTV in our step-down unit, and it's a great device. It works very well, and it has high pressure limits and very high PEEP limits. We can use a PEEP of 24 on the LTV, which we have gone up to 22 on some of our infants with severe chronic lung disease. So there have been times that's the only device we were able to put some children on while we were trying to get them mobile and moving around, kind of their physical therapy, and then while we were trying to get them ready to go home. So that was a great device. But the downside to having these flow sensors within your circuit is it's a proprietary circuit. That's the only circuit that you can use on that device. And if you're in an area where you have limitations on your products getting to you, then you have no choice but to purchase, which can be very expensive, that circuit only. You can't go to other circuits because all of your sensing, all of your sensors are within the circuit. So that is a challenge. Next, we have our modes. The mode names are trademarked by the companies. So this is the biggest reason why we can't have the same name on every mode. Is early on, at least in the US, the FDA let the companies trademark their names. So because of this and the challenges that we have all had with training others to understand and know what they're ordering and what they're putting into the devices, and know and understand from device to device to device the different modes and what they are. Rob Chapburn and his group, which I have the original manuscript listed here, came up with a general taxonomy for modes. And this is what it looks like. This is just the first half of it, but they step through every type of mode that is out there, and they give a preferred name, and then what the intended meaning is, and then what similar terms are, which is really the terms that are trademarked by different companies. So we shouldn't use them as their actual name because they're only available on one type of device. And that has been a problem. And this taxonomy, as you can imagine, the way there's a lot of modes and how the mode works is very complicated. So this didn't really take off. And we're not going to go into a lot of the modes specifically because I know that's a future session. But it was too complicated for everybody to really onto right away. So then in 2014, they came up with a simplified version. They listened. So they take more of it where you're looking at your ventilator breath control variable. Is it pressure? Is it volume? And then what is the breath sequence? Is it mandatory, conventional? Is it all ventilator driven? Is it all intermittent? Is it all the patient? So is it CMV, is it IMV, or is it CSV? And then what is the targeting scheme? What's our set point, or what's our adaptive option? Is it pressure? Is it volume? Is it minute ventilation driven? And then that equals the mode. And that's how they kind of put their naming together. And that's how people should really think about it and say, I want a mode. If you don't know what the device is, but you know what you want for the patient, is I want a pressure controlled mode that the patient can breathe on their own, but I want to target tidal volume, or I want to target minute ventilation, or I want a volume mode that targets volume. It's very different than we have a pressure mode that targets volume, which oftentimes have a volume name in them. So it's even the naming schemes that you have from the manufacturers, you need to kind of dig in this way to figure out what type of breath it is. And what the targeting scheme is. The most common mode that everybody says to me, I want PRVC. Well, if I don't have a servo ventilator, I can't give you PRVC because that's trademarked to McKay. But I can give you a pressure mode that has IMV and targets tidal volume because that's what that mode is. Or if they just say, I want a volume mode that targets volume, and the patient can breathe on their own. But all of your pressure supported breath, and that, even on just about every ventilator, is still going to be pressure. So it's a little discussion. People get very frustrated with me, but when they just have never used draggers before, our institution has draggers. have to understand what they want so that I can give that and dial that in. And a lot of these newer modes are what we call closed loop or adaptive support modes. In the taxonomy, they're referred to as adaptive support modes. And this is where the ventilator will continuously monitor the patient breath, and it dynamically adjusts the output settings in real time to reach your particular goal. And here are those more common modes. The PRVC that I had just talked about is pressure regulated volume control. It's really a pressure breath, but it's reading the tidal volume. It's looking at your last two breaths and what was that tidal volume. And if I said I wanted a tidal volume of 50, but it's giving me a tidal volume of 20, it's going to increase flow and increase pressure until I can get that tidal volume. Adaptive support ventilation is similar. It adjusts the respiratory rate and the tidal volume to maintain a targeted minute ventilation. Proportional assist adjusts pressure proportionally to the patient's spontaneous efforts, allowing the patient to dictate the breath size and timing, while the ventilator just assumes a portion of the work, but not all of the work. And then NAVA is a little bit different, neurally adjusted ventilatory assist, and this takes a look at your neuro drive and of the patient. So it takes its cues really from the brain talking to the diaphragm to say, take a breath. And that's when that diaphragm starts to move, is when it takes its signal to give a breath. And to the extent that it provides support is how much that ventilator or how much the diaphragm contracts, the force of which it uses. And you only have 3 settings in this mode: PEEP, FiO2, and then the NAVA level, which tell you exactly how it decides how much it gives assistance. It's not as straightforward as pressure support. There's a proprietary algorithm of which they will not let us have. I even offered to sign an NDA so that I could get that algorithm to understand this better, and they won't have that conversation with us. But it's undisclosed exactly how it works, but it does. It works quite well, particularly in our smaller patients, and not just invasively, but non-invasively to help with synchrony. So benefits of our controlled loop ventilation modes is it really does enhance synchrony. It is more lung protective in that it gives the patient what the patient needs at the time they need it, and it can reduce their workload quite a bit. The downside to these is that the clinician does not have control of the weaning in a lot of cases. And it may be difficult to determine how much work the patient is doing and how much work the ventilator is doing to know if they're actually doing more of the work, which is what was intended. But the machine can overwean quite easily depending on the goal parameters that are put in the patient condition. If you are using a minute ventilation based goals and the patient starts to breathe rapidly for pain, the ventilator only looks back at a certain period of time. So they might take that as the patient is waking up and then wean down the tidal volume or pressure that they're providing support for and take rate away. And then they get some pain medication and now they stop breathing. So it will take what should be several breaths before the ventilator realizes that they're not meeting their goals. And then it'll start to provide that mandatory breath again. So you really have to keep an eye on that with the goals of what's going on with the patient condition. So this is some of the most common ventilators, and then their modes that are very similar. So the tag there is the taxonomy, and then what it's really called in the different devices. Now, this was in 2014, so this is not updated, and it's only 4 of the most common. However, the Covidian PB840 now is owned by Medtronic. But this is so you can see a lot of the differences with them. NAVA is one that is only at McKay. When that was developed, it was purchased by them, so you can only get that in their ventilator. And that's a problem with some of these adaptive modes and how well they work, but you have to have that device. And it's really hard from an educational standpoint to have 3 or 4 different devices, particularly when they all work a little bit differently, from an educational standpoint, to make sure everybody understands how to use the ventilators. But as with NAVA and some of these other adaptive support modes that they have, there isn't a whole lot of research telling us the best patients and how to use them best. So in my opinion, a lot of the companies haven't put a lot of money into getting this research so that these modes have really taken off. And that's a problem for all of us as well as for them, because there's nothing that they can point to say, see, we told you NAVA works, you should use it for this, this, and this, or use it this way on this type of patient, this way on this type of patient, because you can't use it in a pediatric patient the same way that you use it in an adult patient. We've tried and we've seen that, and we definitely need a lot more research on the best way to use these modes in different disease processes and patient sizes. So when looking at transport ventilators versus ICU ventilators, there are some differences in how they function. Most transport ventilators are turbine driven because we want that longer battery life. We want to only have one gas source to be carrying around with us. And most of the ICU ventilators have compressed gas driven, where they have both medical grade air and oxygen at high pressures going into the machine. And they need a constant power source. Most of them don't have but a 45-minute to an hour battery. Some of them have hot swappable batteries that you can put in them if you want to be able to transport on them, but that is actually rare. Transport ventilators they can usually have a single or a double limb circuit. Oftentimes, if you're going into a smaller neonatal pediatric mode, you have to use a double limb, and different expiratory valves and things can get a little complicated there. But the ICU ventilators are usually always a double limb circuit. You have a limit on patient size with your transport ventilators. Generally, there's a limit on low tidal volume or high pressure in a volume mode. So then you have to go to using a pressure mode, which oftentimes, we have to do even though we want to be volume ventilating. And you have a limitation on the modes that you have available. You're not going to have these adaptive modes in most situations on your transport ventilators. But in the ICU ventilators, they have all the bells and whistles. If you purchase it, they have the full range. Oftentimes, they will offer an option that's just an adult mode. But if you want the neonatal and pediatric modes, then you have to, pay extra for that software in that full patient range. There is one that's kind of an exception to this, Hamilton's T1 transport ventilator. Really, if you get the neonatal mode, they have a full range. They have adaptive modes on there. The synchrony is great. It is turbine driven, but you can really get these smaller neonates to trigger on them. We use it actually as our transport ventilator within the hospital, as well as outside the hospital in our transport teams, and it works for the vast majority of patients with very difficult lung disease that we need to move around. So in comparing the different manufacturers, this is kind of who's on the market right now. Hamilton, Draeger, Getinge, Medtronic, Mindray, Zoll, Neon Coden, and GE. They all have some benefits and some downsides to them for the most part, but they're the ones that have critical care ventilators, and they're all pretty comparable. For peds, we look at really the accuracy of their sensors and the durability of the proximal flow sensor. Draeger seems to have a superior flow sensor at this point, but Getinge's distal flow sensors at the device perform very well. It's actually within range, the same as their proximal flow sensor. After the circuit is heated and humidified, if you redo all your calibrations and then look at the sensing, they're pretty similar, which is nice because you cannot use the proximal flow sensor, which is a pain in the butt if you use proximal flow sensors a lot to kind of maintain those over a long period of time, particularly if you're needing to give aerosolized medications. One to really kind of look at coming up now is Neon Coden. Their end-tidal CO2 is just fantastic technology. It's probably the most superior end-tidal device that I've seen, and it is so small it's like a gram. It weighs a gram for its mainstream, and their sensors are really low profile, but they're great. I haven't had a chance to really, take a look at their ventilator and run it through the paces in our lab yet, but really see how it works with our extremes that we kind of use and where we get into problem with some different devices. But their monitoring is very well. So if they're moving that same type of technology into their ventilator, I would imagine it is just as good. Hamilton has a lot of diagnostic testing and maneuvers that you can do within their machine. They probably have the most of all of them. Unfortunately, they're just in adult modes. So that's one thing to look for is in their pediatric mode, what do they offer? And in some devices, we have a problem with Draeger in their neonatal mode. You can't do any inspiratory holds. You can't do any expiratory holds, anything. It's really just basics and their modes of ventilation, but they don't, you have to go into the pediatric modes. You need a minimum tidal volume of 20 in order to go into these other modes, into the pediatric mode in order to get some of these other functions like inspiratory and expiratory hold, which seem basic to be able to do things and collect different ventilator mechanics, but it's a problem. And I have to keep putting kids in ventilator modes that we don't necessarily want them in from a flow dynamic standpoint to do that. So then are you really getting true measures when all of that is changing? And I say no, but we still keep doing it and trying. Zoll purchased all of the Cardinal ventilation portfolio. So they have the LTV series. They had a turbine-driven critical care ventilator that they came out with before they sold their portfolio and decided to get out of mechanical ventilation. It didn't do as well. It didn't perform as well, I think, as they had wanted. Some people love it. And then they have the 3100 A and B series as well. So some emerging directions here: mechanical power monitoring, automatic titrations, and closed loop weaning, which we kind of already talked about. AI decision support. This we could probably talk about for the next hour. People's thoughts on this. The closed loop weaning and automated titrations is already occurring in a lot of the modes. They do need to improve this and potentially look at how the patient is doing over a longer period of time before doing weans to avoid overweaning. This is something that some AI decision support could really help with to make it so that we're not having those problems like we are currently with the modes. But the AI decision support, it's a possibility for the future. This is in clinical trials. There's a red vent trial that is happening that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's more that is doing that with inputting of information like labs and things to say what is the best next move for weaning. I think some of the stuff that would be automated and give you more information without having to input the information would likely happen first with the companies that have monitors and ventilators, because they will easily communicate with each other, like GE, Neon Coden, and Draeger, but you would need to have their monitor and their ventilator, which is a problem. When they both have both types of devices, they don't want to give you the information or the other one the information to really make that connection electronically, and that's a bit of a problem. So right now, for instance, we have Draeger ventilators and GE monitors at our institution, and it was an over a year-long process to get to, they had to actually, Draeger paid for an intermediate company to work through the code between Draeger and GE so that we could get some information from our Draeger monitor, our Draeger ventilators, to project onto our GE devices, monitors, and then from there go into the medical record. So we will always have to use an intermediary of some sort to do that, because GE doesn't want to give Draeger their code, and Draeger doesn't want to give GE their code because they're competitors. So part of the problem there. These algorithms really do need to be tested a lot more for what's currently happening. And then once we're able to get monitor information, that will actually be very meaningful to really help with weaning better. But again, they've got to look over a longer period of time, in my opinion, because of some of the issues that we're having with the adaptive support modes now. But we really need more than just monitor information. So we need some more information probably from the medical record. So it's going to need to be the three systems working together to really help with that. So I'm not sure that AI decision support could go into the ventilator and have it function on its own versus have it being within an electronic medical record to really help us, or an independent third system that will really say, hey, you might want to think about doing this, weaning your weight rate, weaning your PEEP, weaning your whatever, to really help people along quicker than when they would have been looking to do that. And it'll take in the information much quicker. So I know this was quick with a lot of information over a short period of time that we had really to discuss it, but I think we'll move on to the next presenter at this point, was what we were doing, and then going to questions afterwards. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I was asked to do a bit of a summary, but I think you gave a fantastic talk. And one of the very nice things of the talk you gave is that we all use ventilators in our ICU on a daily basis, whatever ventilator we have, and everybody knows how to ventilate best. And it's such an unthinkable. So we cannot imagine an ICU without a ventilator. But your talk so nicely shows how complicated actually these devices are, and how they are built, and that there is so much more than the fancy outside we see and all the fancy waveforms and how it's displayed. So it's really helpful to get a really good understanding of what is behind the hood, and really helpful to to better deliver the ventilation to the patient at the bedside. And starting from the history, I always like the history, and if you see how we went back, and well, in your personal experience with your camp, I mean, it's so fantastic. So this was really great, and it's really challenging. And what I like about your talk as well, you mentioned the various manufacturers and all their differences and how they compete with each other, and that if you are going to buy a ventilator for a unit, you probably do it. We did the same when we had to substitute our ventilators 2 years ago. You're bringing the devices that you think, okay, this might be something for my unit, and you're going to test them in your lab, and you're going to subject them to the extremes to really find their performance. So this was really amazing and really helpful. And I see tons of questions in the Q&A. So I think it's best if our moderators open up the Q&A so that we can address all because there are amazing questions in the chat. So thanks, Natalie. This was really brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, I think it's, the summary really, if we put it into one sentence, is learn what you have and use it well. If you're trying to use a mode that is in another manufacturer, you might not be able to do that in what you have. So just get to know what you have well.
Yeah.
So Natalie, if I can kick off the first question from the chat, how reliable are the algorithm-based calculations in ASV when we are trying to ventilate ARDS, which has a dynamic heterogeneous compliance of the lung?
I haven't really used ASV. We don't have that ventilator. So for the last 14-ish years since I've been at CHOP, I've only been using the Draegers, but so I don't really know how well that works. My understanding of that device is that they've put all of their effort into making it a really good device for adults. And it doesn't work as well in pediatrics. So I would have to kind of look at the literature and talk to some people before I could really answer that question. But I don't have the experience with it, unfortunately. But for adults, people seem to really like it. I don't know if anyone else.
It's limited to, it's limited to a few ventilators, right? And as you say, it's developed for adults, and it uses to the volume, and it uses compliance and resistance. Well, we all know how difficult it is to obtain good compliance and resistance in pediatrics. Don't believe what your ventilator is saying. And they use entitled CO2, but then entitled CO2 is not only ventilation but also perfusion. So it's really tricky to extrapolate the adult stuff to the pediatric population, as always, but in particular for this context.
Yeah, and it's minute ventilation goal based, I believe. So that's hard. I have found, and then it tends to overween. So I think that is one of the things to really worry about as well.
Nicely answered. So there's another question in the chat that's asking regarding NAVA. So how much are NAVA and other smart closed loop modes used in the pediatric patient population? Is it just a matter of time that the healthcare community will start using it extensively? What are the hurdles in using such modes in pediatric population?
NAVA, I think, is used more in the neonatal arena than in pediatrics. If you look at the literature out there, there's more of it that's being used in neonates, and particularly non-invasive NAVA. We have a synchrony problem with our neonates and patients up until about a certain age where really can't get them to synchronize non-invasively in a lot of modes. And really the ventilator that we were able to get them to synchronize non-invasively, the best was with the home care Respironics machines, the trilogies, which are now no longer being supported or sold in the US, unfortunately. So we're really having problems. So non-invasive NAVA has really helped to be able to do synchronized non-invasive support. How well that works and if the synchrony is necessary, other than, the kid looking ugly when they're trying to breathe. There's the DIVA trial that is ongoing that is looking at synchronized versus unsynchronized non-invasive in the NICU. So when that finishes up, we'll get a result on that as to whether the synchrony is even necessary. However, I think there's limited pediatric studies. We just finished up a trial looking at NAVA versus CMV in our severe BPD population. So under 2 years of age, so still a small cohort of patients because it's a orphan disease still at this point. And there's another phase trial that is being planned now. So we'll get to see, but unfortunately, the companies did not put the effort and money into doing trials and seeing how these devices work well with pediatrics or even with adults. They developed this closed loop probably with animal studies. They would have had to in order to get through at least FDA and some of the other regulatory agencies in countries with some minimal human trials, but they were all done in adults, and then we just use them in pediatrics. When we can, we just don't have enough literature to know how well they work in the different populations and really how best to use them and what their downfalls are. So we need a lot more research.
Do you think the limitation of NAVA to the ventilators is an issue here?
Yeah, I do. It has a lot of promise, and it would probably get used a lot more, but you have to have a Mackay servo or getting ventilator. They decided to do that, and interestingly, I had heard confidentially from a source that when they developed this technology and were shopping it around, they went to Dräger first and they wanted it put in the Dräger devices. And Dräger said, we really think this is something that should be standalone so it can be used with any ventilator. It's really good technology. And they wanted it in a ventilator. So they didn't sell it to Dräger and they went somewhere else and they went to Mackay, now Getting.
Okay.
And they put it in their device. So it's stuck, and that was from the people who invented it. But if it was standalone, we could probably use it on more people.
Next.
Thank you. That's So Georgie, take next question.
Yeah, next question, perhaps for Dr. Martin. How does a high frequency oscillating ventilator work, particularly after the Sensormetic's gone? What's the next thing in store for children from infant to adolescence age group? The piston technique is gone, and will we have to live with flow interrupters?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, the Sensormetic device was owned by Vyaire, the last call before they were acquired by Zoll. And the device doesn't meet all the regulations outside the US, so it's pulled off the market everywhere but in the US. The US have the A and the B, I still think. When we are doing the prospect trial, we have, of course, the A and B. So we were reassured by the company that they were still supporting devices out there and making sure that supplies are available for the next few years. But we don't know what the future holds. I know there are some companies trying to make a pediatric oscillator and then a true oscillator with an active exhalation phase like the Sensormetic has. There are a lot of neonatal devices out there. They claim they can oscillate children up to 10 kilograms. I've tested in the lab and it's very disappointing. So they can't. So neonatal oscillators are not suitable for children above, well, let's say 4 or 5 kilograms. So they're really for the NICU. I saw somewhere in the chat about neon cotonite. I haven't seen that one yet. So I don't know if it's what the power of the neon coton is. The thing is, what is necessary, and that's why the Sensormetics has this big piston. You need to have a lot of power. The device has to generate a really big amplitude. And that can only be done with a big piston. So for any company trying to recreate or trying to build on the Sensormetics, you need to have a very strong piston that can generate a similar amplitude. Now there are devices that claim they have oscillation, but they are like a flow interrupter, so they rely on passive exhalation. And I think the Traeger, for example, is a passive exhalation that and at least theoretic danger with that device is that you can have a dynamic hyperinflation because you rely on passive hyperinflation, and if you have an obstructive airway and the lung cannot empty, then potentially there might be dynamic hyperinflation. So let's say the future of high frequency is challenging, and I think a lot of companies are awaiting what Prospect is going to show. So we'll have to wait on that. But if you are looking for an oscillator, I know the Japanese company Metron. I don't have any shares. They have a humming view oscillator, which we tested that one in the lab as well, and it can really, well, it can quite live up to the A, Sensormetics A, which theoretically the A goes theoretically up to 25 kilograms. Now I have to admit, I use the B already in 4, 5, 6 kilogram babies because it's much more powerful, but that's off license. But the humming view is can probably fill the gap outside the US if you don't want a neonatal oscillator.
I would say
Thank you, Dr. Martin.
it's important
Natalie?
for you to talk to your sales reps when you're going to conferences and tell them what you need. The companies decide what to do by customer input, some. So if they're getting a lot of people saying, I need this in pediatrics, I need this in pediatrics, and in different countries, then they'll put some money and effort into that. So it's important when you're at WFPICCS, you're at SCCM or wherever, or when you see them locally, whenever they come in to your hospital, to just really tell them what it is that you need and what you're not getting, what's not in the market, and just keep being vocal about it.
Yeah, that's very important because, like what Natalie said in the beginning, ventilator companies don't care about pediatrics. They care about adults. They care about neonates because there's a lot of emotion involved with neonates, especially if they're prematurely born. They don't care about pediatrics. So they claim that the devices are suitable for pediatrics, but if you look really in detail, most of them fall short significantly. So go and tell them that you need a pediatric ventilator. For example, when we before I had the Avia ventilator. I don't have any shares in any company, so disclaimer. We had the Avia, and I really love the Avia. I miss the Avia. We now have the Getinge, which is a fine ventilator, and I think for most units it's perfectly fine. But when we tested it in the lab, we found out that their so-called pediatric mode could only deliver an inspiratory flow of 30 liters per minute. And for young children, even 30 liters per minute can be much too low. So you had to move to the adult mode of that ventilator very rapidly on. Now they have new software, so they went up to 60 liters per minute. So that's what Natalie's referring to. Go to the company, tell them, okay, you have this, but you tell you can do this, but it's not true, and we need this in the device. We need this in the device.
Excellent. That's the problem. That problem is we don't know how much the flow that is truly going, and it's not measured in the machine. So it's just.
Well, I mean, if you're going to buy a ventilator, and I think Natalie will concur, really read the manual, read the technical specs of the manual. Don't read a glossy brochure, but read the technical specs of the manual. And there the devil is in detail. There's where you find all the limitations of the devices.
Yeah, I agree. We're looking at upgrading our ventilators now too, and we'll probably just upgrade to the next version of Kneyber because that's what we've been doing. But I asked them for a paper manual because I take notes so that I know what questions I want to ask and things I want to do, which I can do electronically. I get that, but I'm still a little old school, so I wanted that paper manual. And what happens though is my current paper manual for the one that we have sits above my desk, and everybody comes and grabs it because they have all my notes. There's tabs in it. We had this question last week. Where was it? Like I put tabs for the most frequently asked questions so that I can get to them, that I get called for, stuff that we've tested in the lab and what we found, and things that I have signed NDAs with Kneyber so that I can get their algorithms so that I know what to do with our patients. So I have all that information in my manual, and other people can see it, so it's easier to kind of pass around. But my father is very disappointed. He always tells me every time I buy a car, I need to read the manual on how the car works so that I know what to do in situations. I've never read my car manual, but I have read every ventilator manual that we have, because to me that's more important.
Perfect. So there's a question in the chat. So Natalie, are the ventilators which are stationary but have the option of being transport capable, like for example Hamilton recent models, pressure or turbine driven?
Most of your critical care ventilators are going to not be turbine driven. They're going to be compressed gas flow. They get more range that way. There's limitations with what they can do mechanically with the turbine driven machines. Not that the turbine driven machines can't do it. They can, because we see that with the T1. It's just not where they want to put their money and effort, because they're trying to really optimize for the adult population, as we've been discussing. So that's a limitation. Some of your critical care ventilators, we have air concentrators on all of our critical care ventilators. Kneyber sells them. I'm sure that most of the companies do, so that if we have a power outage, if there's any sort of an outage that we need to move our patients quickly and don't have enough transport ventilators, that we can do that. We also have battery packs on some of our devices, but you're limited to the length of the internal battery, which oftentimes is maxed out on critical care ventilators around an hour and a half. And that's going to change. If you're in really high settings and you're using a lot of power, then it's going to be less. The transport ventilators generally have a longer internal battery, but they also have hot swappable options that can be, that are charging, where you can just take one out, put another one in, and you get 2 more hours of power. So that's why for transporting, it's really the power piece that is a really big issue, and needing to have that second compressed gas. Not sure if I answered that question or not.
Thanks, Natalie. Perhaps another one for Dr. Martin. In conventional modes, we can measure transpulmonary pressure and find actual pressures at the level of the alveoli. In HFOV, the mean airway pressure displayed on the screen is the pressure measured at the Y connector. How do we know the alveolar pressure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm a big fan of esophageal pressure manometry to measure transpulmonary pressure. It's the global transpulmonary pressure, so we really have to understand the difference in heterogeneity in alveolar behavior. So we measure the plateau pressure minus the esophageal pressure as a surrogate for the pleural, which gives the recall, the elastic pressure of the alveolus. With high frequency, I mean, we are probing it a bit, but it's really, really unclear how to really measure it. And I'm not sure if we really need the number as well, because the whole physics of the oscillator are so different, and you give a much higher mean airway pressure, and you know that if you use a high frequency, the higher the frequency, the smaller the amplitude will be in the at the alveolar level. So yeah, I think it's really tricky to calculate the transalveolar pressure in high frequency. So right now we cannot. We only have a suggestion, and I said I'm still puzzling if I need that number to appropriately set the oscillator at this stage. If you look at the transpulmonary pressure, I know we have we, at least in peds definitely, and I think in adults as well, we still have to show that a transpulmonary pressure based ventilator approach actually improves outcome, or if it reduces inflammation, or if it reduces multiple system organ failure, we don't know. So from a physiologic perspective, it's really fancy, and I really like it. But if it's really going to help us in improving outcomes, we need to establish. Plus, we see that a lot of companies are pulling the catheters off the market because of all the regulations again, and they don't make any profit. So even esophageal catheters are becoming less and less available. Our hope is a company in Argentina who have a pediatric specific catheter now, which I think is FDA approved. And they hope to have a CE mark early next year. So maybe next year we can answer the question on the transpulmonary pressure in high frequency.
Unfortunately, this is the case. If there's no profit, things really important things goes out of the market. So, Natalie, there's a question regarding for low-income countries who have to manage with good quality versus cost balance. What should be the minimum parameter that you would recommend that should be checked in choosing a ventilator for a unit for sustainable functioning? That's a tough one.
I would think so. This is a difficult one, and one that Michael and I talk about often. You want a ventilator that is turbine driven, so you only need an oxygen source that has a relatively good length of time for your internal battery if your electricity is intermittent. Right now, of what's on the market, you're mostly going to have devices, I believe, that are considered transport devices or home care devices. There aren't many critical care devices. Covidien had one that was a critical care ventilator they had just come out with that was turbine driven, but it didn't perform as well as they thought, and I think that was part of the decision to sell. I don't know if Zoll kept that device up or not. But right now, I would say that the Hamilton T1, the problem with that is it's a proprietary circuit, including the expiratory valve. So you have to get their circuit and their expiratory valve in order for it to work. And its flow sensors do very well. But, that's marketed as a transport ventilator, but you can use it, as your primary device long term. You just would want to find a way to humidify that. So even if it's just with an HME, although we usually do active humidification with our PEDS patients, that's the only problem with using a transport ventilator is they're not necessarily set up with humidification.
And Dr. Martin, what do you think regarding the weight or the ventilators that goes with a specific weight rather than to have a wider range to accompany office? Like some ventilators goes for specific weight, and the flow determines is when you open it up, it's gonna cover neonate and pediatric and the adults. Yeah, it's you save on the money, but is it really delivering proper flow as you're targeting?
Yeah, that's a good question. But then, well, that comes a bit back to the question that we discussed in the beginning. You have to read the text specs of the manual. I think all modern day ICU ventilators will tell you that they can do neonates, they can do the small children, they can do all children. Uh, um, but you really have to read the specs and see if it matches what you want. And I said we encountered that one with the gating. Yeah, and it depends also a little bit on what you're most familiar with. I mean, for example, the most let's say the ventilators, if you go into the adult mode, they have this low flow to very high flow range, but they display the number differently. They give you the same numbers, but it is displayed differently. So it depends from ventilator to ventilator, and it depends on what your unit is accustomed to, and if you want to do just basic simple ventilation, probably then you don't need as much fancy tools as if you are more interested in more research or more physiology, whatever. Yeah, so if you want to find a specific ventilator that meets your requirements, you have to test several ones and see which ones fits best.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you, Georgie.
Is the Hamilton T1 exclusively for transport application?
Marketed as a transport ventilator, but I don't think, as I'd kind of given in my last response, you can use it longer term. You just need to work out your humidification, whether you put on an HME or find a way to adapt active humidification.
Yeah, we use the T1 also only for the transport. But we are a bit silly maybe, but we care of course about humidification, but we use passive humidification in all our patients, even the ones who are in the unit. So that's quite easy. So we can use the same HME we have in our ICU patients as on the Hamilton one. But if you're going to use it, like Natalie is telling you, if you want to use it outside transport for longer, well, then there are a lot of things you have to consider.
Staying on the portable ventilators, is there a portable ventilator which can do high flow NIV, mechanical ventilation, and oscillation in children?
All in one.
Well, most ventilators can offer you high flow nasal oxygen, can do non-invasive, can do invasive mechanical ventilation. I don't know what portable ventilators cannot do high frequency because it needs too much energy.
There is one Fabian ventilator which they are marketing as a transport ventilator for HFO. We have been using it for smaller children up to 5-6 kilos. We use it for oscillator for transport. Fabian.
No.
There's also a high frequency transport vent that we have. I forget the name of it. It'll come to me, but it's pretty much the VDR essentially. But it takes a lot of gas. So you really have to carry a lot of gas with you to make sure that you don't run out. And it's pneumatically powered, so you have to have the gas. You can't run it without gas.
Yeah.
Perfect. So there is a question, Dr. Martin, regarding one type of high frequency produced by non-codon, and it shows that tidal volume during high frequency in pediatric patient. How should this value be used, and what is the target range?
Well, that's a good question. I'm going to give you a not so politically correct answer. I don't care about tidal volume and oscillation. Because the stroke volume the oscillator generates is below dead space. So I'm not sure what the best stroke volume should be. So I don't need a device that gives you the stroke volume. From that matter, but then it might be me, and I differ from, for example, David Dinge from the neonatology. I don't understand volume guarantee in high frequency, because then it assumes that you know a minimum amount of volume that at least should be in. So, and I do acknowledge that, especially with the Sensormatics, you lack a lot of monitoring tools and know how to properly set the device. But I don't think that having a tidal volume displayed on the device will really help you finding the optimal mean airway pressure during oscillation. I think the number is so small that I don't know if, for example, if you go from 1.3 to 1.4, if that would be clinically really relevant.
Right.
Don't know what do you think, Natalie?
Natalie?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we know enough about what to do with that tidal volume number. We'll need some more research and to compare for that. Probably some animal research first to figure out what's the right tidal volume when you're given that such a low volume.
The next question, in cases of airway obstruction, when the expiration is prolonged and the diaphragm contraction is not normal, does NAVA work well?
I don't think we know the answer to that question either. I can tell you with our severe BPD population that we had it on, some of those kids had severe overinflation and some dynamic obstruction. And as long you have to, your length of your NAVA catheter and where it's going to be, you'll have to move to where the diaphragms are. So it'll be lower, and keeping your catheter in the right position as that changes can be a little challenging with those patients. But you have to be a little bit tolerant of the work. So your NAVA, your EDI peak is likely going to be higher than what you would normally see. You don't want to necessarily over support them because then it'll take away their drive. So it's almost like, using it in a COPD patient. It's a bit challenging, but we're just starting to figure out how to use the mode in those type of situations. So that's a long answer for I don't know.
Yeah, and I fully agree. And I think even the whole issue of expiratory asynchrony is so complicated and so little studied yet. I mean, we've all been focusing on the inspiratory asynchrony and on the cycling off, but asynchrony during the expiration, it's completely blank field of research.
So the next question to Natalie, do you calibrate your ventilator using flow analyzers? If yes, how frequent? Is there any protocol like it should be done like once every 6 months or once a year, or depends on numbers of hours used by the ventilator?
So I don't calibrate our devices. Our biomedical engineers do. So I don't know exactly how they do that, but it is on hours of use. The manufacturers give a recommendation that you go through servicing and so many hours of use. We do not let our devices sit very long. We're a very busy institution. We have a lot of mechanically ventilated children on a daily basis. So our machines are almost constantly in use. So we actually backed up when we do our servicing is earlier than what was recommended by the manufacturer. And we came to the decision on the numbers as to when we started having failures of our devices and what hours of use they were at from their last PMs. But how they do the servicing and recalibrate them, I don't really know. That each each manufacturer wants it done a certain way, and then they train our engineers to do that, but I don't actually do it.
No, same for us.
Do either of you have experience with the VOCSN marketed by Ventec Life, the ventilator, which is now being used to substitute the Trilogy series? It seems to work well for over 5 kilo babies, but we can't use it in smaller babies yet at my institution.
Yeah, the Voxen or the V Pro. We tested that in our bench lab before we purchased a couple of them, because we have to have them because our home care companies are using them. So we need to be able to transition to whatever home care device the company that they're going to use has. We had some challenges with synchrony that we brought in the engineers into our lab and showed them this, and they actually made some changes, and there should be a update coming out soon with those changes that we hope is going to help with that synchrony problem. We have the V Pro is what we'll be purchasing once they fix this problem. Because we don't want all of the things, like it comes with a suction and cough assist in it. That was how it was originally marketed. We didn't want all of that in one device, because when one thing breaks, you have nothing. And we have all the other extraneous devices in the hospital, so we don't need it all in one, because it was made just for home care. But then the new company bought them and understood this a little bit better and kind of broke it out so that you can purchase it all ad hoc with what it is that you want. So we were able to get just the ventilator and not the other pieces, which is the V Pro. But when they fix some of these synchrony problems for our smaller patients, it'll be better.
Excellent. So next question to Dr. Martin, because of his paper regarding the mechanical power. So we have some new ventilator which continuously displays mechanical power. How accurate are they in the pediatric age group?
I think we have another expert on the continuous monitoring of mechanical power among us, and that is Dr. Farhan. So I think he should answer that question.
Well, we recently, just yesterday, we published our study. Dr. Martin is our mentor in that study. So we found that in volume control, there is very good correlation and agreement between the automatically displayed mechanical power and the mechanical power which we can measure by equations in volume control. But in pressure control, that agreement is not very accurate, particularly in smaller children. If the children are a little bigger, then agreement is better.
So the question regarding to Natalie and Martin is regarding what we see really displayed on the ventilators. Most of these ventilators were built for adults, and it's really not accurately for pediatric build. And what's really reflecting displayed through this, we have to question it, and should we really depends on it, or rather that we go and found a surrogate for it, for example, through the blood gas or another calculation that's really going to reflect to us, for example, transpulmonary pressure or something that's really going to tell us what's really going through that child, rather than just take for granted that number exists in that ventilator.
I don't know what number you're talking about. So your tidal volume and your pressure measurements are going to be pretty accurate. I mean, they have to be within a certain range for their regulatory approvals. So they're really very accurate for all the ages that they're approved for. When you start to get outside of that approval range, you don't know. You need to test it to see. We have found that the devices that we use are what they're displaying from your pressure and your tidal volume. They are accurate, even lower than, say, if they're 5 kilos is their approval range. We're able to accurately read lower than what they say their minimum is. So looking at, again, what Martin said, look at your manual and see. So a lot of them say they're 5 kilos, they're down to 5 kilos, but they still think we're ventilating at 10 mLs per kilo. So their minimum tidal volume is 50. And I wouldn't use a tidal volume of 50 on a 5 kilo kid in ARDS. So you have to look at that, and that's where they're, where they say their limit is, that's where they're going to be accurate. If you're looking at, say, compliance and resistance measures, I would say no, like that's dynamic. That's not going to be your stand. If you want to know your true compliance and resistance, you really need to be in a volume controlled breath, on a mechanical breath, not a spontaneous breath. And a lot of these devices, when they're doing some of these measurements, they don't select out just the mechanical breaths to do that calculation on. And if they need some sort of an inspiratory hold in order to get a number, if they need a plateau pressure, that's not happening, so you have to, it's an estimate or a measure. So those I would question. I never use the dynamic compliance and resistance off the machine. I select 3 breaths, freeze the screen, do some measurements, and do some calculations.
Exactly. So the final question is, I think Dr. Martin answered that in the chat, but I would like to take your answer, Natalie. As a trainee in PICU, if I want to use one mechanical ventilation in our PICU and one mode that would be the best one to have and use, what would be your choice?
What would be my choice, or what would be your choice? I mean, as a trainee in the unit, you're not going to get a say in what machine you're using. So I would say figure out the machine, find somebody to teach you on it, and figure out how to use that well. Most people aren't going to get to choose what devices they have in their unit. These devices cost $30,000 a piece. So when they buy them, you're going to have them for a while, and you can't just go and buy another one. Most of the devices, are the same. I mean, for me, I would like to have the McKay right now because I want to do more research on NAVA and how well it works or doesn't work in certain situations. And not having devices makes it difficult to do that research. We currently have the Draeger. That is what CHOP has decided that they wanted to use for quite some time. And I think it's a very good device for what we use it for. And honestly, I like the company. They're very willing to let you talk to the engineers and have conversations and tell them what your challenges are and what you need. And they're very responsive. So I think it's more important that you are selecting a device that you can do most things with and have a company that you can work with that is willing to make changes and have conversations. If they're not going to let you talk to their engineers, that's a flag for me. I always want to talk to the engineers because I want to understand how certain things work better. And if they won't let me do that, if I have to go through too many sales hoops to get there, I'm done. I don't have the patience for it, unfortunately. So I move on.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It was an excellent session. Amazing talk by Dr. Natalie and great insights by Dr. Martin Kneyber as usual. And we had a very good question answer session where we had excellent questions and great answers and a lot of learning all around. And this session will be available online from tomorrow for those who could not attend or those who want to see this session once again for learning. And next month, on the 3rd Thursday, we are going to meet again for a great debate. This is going to be a debate between HFNC and NIV, and I'm sure that will be a very exciting debate. So now we take leave from the WFPICCS Respiratory Critical Care Group. Thank you very much, Dr. Martin, and thanks a lot, Dr. Natalie. And I thank all my colleagues also. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And please reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Martin.
everyone.
Bye-bye.